I feel very honored to have been asked to speak on this forum today, and I hope I'm able to do some justice to this invitation. Well, a caveat first. I'm in no position of authority to believe that I can tell you anything that will help you to become better writers of stories. So I'm going to stay clear of that domain. What I do intend to do today is to state the obvious, to talk about something that you know but may not be conscious of because it is so obvious. So I'm going to use the words narrative and stories interchangeably. They are synonymous, but in the modern understanding, I don't know if you know there's a nuanced difference along with similarities between the two words. And if you understand the nuanced differences between narrative and story, you will probably get where I'm trying to take you. All right, so let's begin with saying that narrative is an essential part of human existence, as essential as language itself. In fact, narratives come to us from the moment language begins to be used in sentences, howsoever fractured. In fact, the moment a subject is accompanied by a verb, it may well be the beginning of a narrative. The capability to narrate begins to manifest itself in children around the age of 3 or 4 when they start putting verbs together, kriya, together with nouns. Incidentally, this also coincides with the first memories we have of childhood as adults, uh, implying thereby that memory itself largely depends on its faculty to store in terms of narrative. Well, narratives are means of integrating experience with comprehension. Through the narratives, we all learn to invent ourselves because it is only through narration that we recreate what we have experienced, thought, or felt. At many levels, I think we become the stories we tell, and we also become the stories we have been told. We are both the producers and the products of stories. We control them, they control us, and sometimes I think this dividing line of control, who controls whom, becomes very blurred. Nonetheless, we all belong to a community that shares its stories, and our stories give us both identity, individual identity, social identity, and a sense of history. So I'm reminded of a very beautiful quotation. I'm not too sure if I'll be able to do justice to the exact words, but Daniel Dennett somewhere says that our fundamental tactic of self-protection, of self-control, and self-definition is not spinning webs or building dams, but telling stories. And more particularly, concocting and controlling the story we tell others and ourselves about who we are. Just as spiders don't have to think when they're spinning a web, or beavers don't have to think when they're building dams, similarly, we, normal human beings, not the professional storytellers, don't consciously and deliberately figure out what narratives to tell and how to tell them. Our tales are naturally spun, but for most part, we don't spin them, they spin us. So our consciousness and our narrative selfhood is a product of these tales. They're not a source of these tales. Okay, that's what he says. So we use narratives to share our experience of the world, with the world, and in doing so, we tell ourselves that we are not alone in this experience because there's somebody to share this experience with. And when we hear other people telling us similar experiences, narrating their life stories, there is a sense of bonding. There is a sense of belonging to a community. And when these stories happen to be similar, that's what connects us together in one community. So we're ideally and actually only members of communities that tell the same stories. And at the same time, stories around the world, as it was discussed yesterday, follow some very set motifs. There are only as many stories that can be told. For example, the story of Cinderella finds itself narrated in some form or the other through centuries, across cultures, across countries, as diverse as China, India, France, Ireland. The fact that it is so indicates that human experience is fundamentally universal. Otherwise, how can the same Cinderella story or the same Cinderella story motif be found in countries as geographically apart as India, France, China, Ireland? So we're all actually products of the same collective unconscious, only its manifestation is culturally colored. And there are stories inside us, there are stories around us, there are stories beyond us. If you look for stories, you don't only find stories in short stories or the narrative genre of literature. Let's see where all we can see stories. And in the most unsuspecting of places, we actually are only listening to stories and only producing and reproducing stories. So beginning with literature, of course, fiction, drama, some forms of poetry as well, for example, epic, ballad, even lyrical sometimes. Prose has narrative. The oral tradition, of course, is all narrative. I think the most idealized notion of the nation and patriotism actually only depend on storytelling. Otherwise, it's only a bhukhand, right? It's only a piece, a dharti ka tukda. But what makes that dharti ka tukda Bharat Mata? It is stories. And then we participate in those stories, and then we become perpetrators of those stories. Similarly, across the border, Pakistan would have similar stories about its own glory. It's just that we don't agree with them. So सरहदें कोई भी हो सकती हैं, फसाना एक ही है, सिर्फ उसकी भाषा अलग है. Journalism is nothing but the story of the day. News is nothing but story of the moment of the day. Incidents are stories. Reporting is all about stories. Photography is a lot about stories. A photograph is the most, you say this is a very, very eloquent photograph. What does that mean? It means that you look at a photograph and it speaks to you. Now, it doesn't really speak to you in verbal terms, but it speaks to you because the story pops out. All right. So photojournalism depends on stories that can be narrated or articulated through photographs. Similarly, you're maintaining a diary every evening. What are you doing? You're maintaining a story of the day. You're maintaining a narrative of the day. Even if you're maintaining a financial diary, it's the story of what was lost and what was gained in business. Cinema is story, documentary is story, graphic novels are stories, posters are stories, banners are stories, paintings are stories. I think Professor Hem Kumar Chatterjee is going to talk about the visual stories that we encounter. Music, a lot of music is story, film music, even non-film music, videos, folk music. All music is narrative. Dance is narrative. Classical dancers in India are narrative. They narrate stories all the time. Folk dances are stories. Then people's personalities are stories. What does a person look like? What is his facial expression? What are the clothes he's wearing? What is the body posture that he's carrying? What is the gait? How does he walk? How does he speak? What language does he speak? What is his accent? Every little ingredient that goes into constituting a person's personality is a narrative. It tells a story. Most of the time, we are reading these stories. We are reading people as stories, except that we don't know we are reading stories. Our culture is a story that a community has narrated to us, that we are embodying and also reproducing the same story. Our myths are stories, legends are stories, anthropology as a science is a story, medical science at some level is a story. Psychology is a story. Psychotherapy depends heavily on storytelling. I'm telling my story unconsciously, and my psychotherapist is listening and listening. Um, you know, he's listening to me while I'm not even aware that he's present there. And then, in addition to the stories that I'm narrating to him, he's able to read the stories I'm not narrating to him. So there are stories that are narrated to tell. There are stories that are narrated to hide, and a psychotherapist will be able to read the stories that you're narrating to hide and to tell both. Okay, so there are stories. Look at the theories of evolution, the scientific theories of evolution. Look at the Big Bang theory. Look at the theory of Darwin. Look at the religious theories of evolution, the Genesis. There is a Hindu theory of human genesis. There's a Christian theory of human genesis. There's stories everywhere. I'm just trying to tell you why. Then look at the grapevine. Look at the gossip. Look at propaganda. What are we doing with stories? What are we doing with narratives? We know, whether we know it advertently or inadvertently, we know that a narrative is a potent, persuasive tool and has the ability to shape beliefs and change minds. All right? Which is why we indulge in gossip, which is why we indulge in propaganda. And all these manifestations and all these forms of narrative are so transparent that we don't even know what they're doing to us. We know what we want to do with them, with the use of with these forms of narrative. But when we are subject to these similar forms of narrative, they're so transparent we don't know they're influencing us. Fashion and clothes is a story, it's a narrative. So the industry tells us, no, there's a new story this year, please. The story last year is outdated. And we say, okay, we'll tell the same story. So we start telling the same story. We start reproducing the same story in whatever form. The lifestyle that I'm living is a story. My house is a story. My walls are stories. The paintings on my walls, the color of my curtains are stories. The products you go and buy are stories about you, are stories about the stories that you have heard about these products, the stories that you have heard that these products will do to you if you will buy these products. The city you live in, the buildings in this city, the lanes in this city, the smells, the sounds of this city, everything is a story, everything is a narrative. And then, of course, all these stories have additional stories, additional narratives, depending on many chains of association that they will lead you into. So your life experiences come and connect with your present experience, and then there's like a new complex story, a new complex narrative that will emerge out of it. Ideology is a story. Ideology uses stories. Ideology uses narratives, because unless and until ideology can use the tool of narrativization, it will not be able to naturalize what it wants to say. It will not be able to make it transparent. So if somebody tells me, believe in God, I don't know who God is. If somebody tells me, believe in truth, I don't know what truth is. So this ideology has to narrativize itself. It has to resort to stories in order to tell me in so many different ways that this is the right way of living, this is the right way of behaving, this is the right way of interacting and transacting with life, with people. Our aspirations and dreams are stories. Materials are stories. For example, there's a whole new understanding of what material memory is all about. So they say things can tell stories. This whole discourse on partition, India and Pakistan's partition, we understand a lot of people's emotions through the materials they have in their homes. For example, किसी के घर में लोटा है, किसी के घर में कोई ज्वेलरी है, किसी के घर में कोई कपड़े हैं, किसी के घर में कोई कंबल है जो वहां से भागते हुए लेके आए थे. So there's this beautiful book by Anchal Malhotra called Remnants of a Partition, and it deals with material memory. कि किस तरह से हर एक चीज आपके लिए कहानी है, एक फसाना है. And then around this concept of memory being a story, we have memorials, we have war memorials, we have museums. Talking of museums, I'm reminded of yet another beautiful book. Yesterday, Manan was talking about Oran Pamuk. He's written a beautiful book called The Museum of Innocence. और इस किताब के अंदर ये जो कैरेक्टर है केमाल, ये he falls in love with Fusion and जहां जहां जाता है, जितनी बार फ्यूजन के साथ वो डेट पे जाता है या उसको कहीं मिलता है, वहां से कुछ ना कुछ उठा के चुरा लेता है. फ्यूजन ने सिगरेट पी है, उसका जो लास्ट का बट बच गया वो उठा के ले आएगा, एक उसका इयररिंग चुरा के ले आएगा, उसका हैंकरचीफ चुरा के ले आएगा और घर में आके एक म्यूजियम में रखता जाता है. So what are these butts of cigarette? What is this broken cup that he picks up from there? It is a story of a moment that he has spent with her. All right. And it's going to mean a lot later on when he's lost this woman, when she dies. So memories are information basically that are stored inside of us. And when they're retrieved as memories, they are retrieved as narrative structures in the narrative form. All right. So all experience is encoded as narrative. Otherwise, experience just goes into the unconscious. Unconscious, the Freudian unconscious is one dark abyss. एक खाली कमरा है, अंधेरा, जिसके अंदर हम फेंकते चले जाते हैं सब कुछ. उसके अंदर वो कोई chronological sequence के अंदर नहीं arrange होता, कोई files के अंदर arrange नहीं होता है. But when we retrieve any information or any experience from the unconscious, from that dark abyss, it is decoded as a narrative. Okay, so there is much, much more in human life that is thoroughly infiltrated by fiction, by narrative. Not fiction, but fictiony, narrative-like. The most unsuspecting places, sports. Sports, for example. हम सोचेंगे sports में क्या काम है, story का, narrative का. But if you've ever watched WWE, वो तो खैर एक बहुत अलग ही level है story telling का और narrative का. लेकिन क्रिकेट मैच, जब तक हम कमेंट्री नहीं सुनते हैं, उसका नैरेटिवाइजिंग नहीं सुनते हैं, तब तक हमें उस पूरे क्रिकेट मैच का आनंद ही नहीं आ रहा है. Real combat sports like boxing, like wrestling, they always use a lot of storytelling conventions. Boxing promoters have long understood that fights don't attract fan interest or moolah, money, unless they feature compelling personalities and their backstories. तो जब मैच होने वाला होगा, उससे पहले जो दो लोग उसमें मैच जीतने लड़ने वाले हैं, उनके बारे में, उनकी लाइफ की कितनी सारी स्टोरीज जो कमेंटेटर्स हैं या प्रोमोटर्स हैं, वो हमें फैंस को सुनाएंगे या जो ऑडियंस है उसको सुनाएंगे. So this pre-fight hype shapes a story about why the men are fighting and usually how they came to despise each other. And sometimes this whole hype is notoriously fictionalized. Men who are friendly off camera pretend to hate each other so much for the sake of a good drama, for the sake of a good story. And that will attract people to watch this. Olympics में भी इसी तरह से होता है. एथलीट्स के बारे में कितनी सारी कहानियां आप पहले सुना देंगे और फिर जब वो that gun will go off when they're finally going to run, we are all basically sitting and watching these epic battles that these athletes are going to fight. And the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat is going to be so much more exhilarating and so much more disappointing. Only because there is a story behind this athlete that has managed to invoke some kind of emotional empathy and an emotional connect with this person. So similarly, जब films release होनी होती हैं, उससे पहले कितनी सारी scandalous stories float कर देते हैं actors के बारे में, because we have to tell stories about these people to sell other stories that they're going to perform in. Fine. So social scientists define television commercials as fictional screen media because they're only half-minute short stories, advertisements. A commercial can rarely just say that a laundry detergent works very well, therefore buy it. What will it do instead? It will show that it works very well through a story about an overworked mom, an overworked woman with rascally kids, and then a laundry room triumph. Okay, and that is the story that most women will buy, and that is why they'll buy the detergent. Similarly, a jewelry store will sell a story to the men about how buying a particular diamond necklace will prove their love to the woman. So these small little half-minute commercials are only small stories that the media is showing us. Ad campaigns, अमूल क्या करता है? अमूल बटर. जो भी करंट रनिंग रियल लाइफ एपिसोड होता है, इंसिडेंट होता है, एक रियल लाइफ स्टोरी होती है, उसको पकड़ता है और एक बहुत ही ह्यूमरस तरीके से उसको हमेशा एक अपनी एड में इनकलकेट कर लेता है. So it is using stories and then it is recreating that story to sell itself. Fine. So what are archaeologists doing? They're doing similar things. They are digging up stones, they're digging up bones, and then they're piecing them together to make a saga about the past. What are historians doing? Historians are storytellers too. So, many historians, at least these days, I think there's so much of a disagreement and so much of an argument and debate that many of the accounts in school textbooks, are rife with distortions and omissions, and that they are closer to myth than history. And then there's a counter point of view to that. Business executives are increasingly told that they must be creative storytellers. They have to spin compelling stories about their products and brands, and they have to emotionally transport consumers. Only then will they sell. Political commentators क्या करते हैं? In an election, it's not just an election. It is a whole combat about a whole narrative that goes behind the building of these politicians. All right. So there are conflicting stories about the nation's past, the nation's future, what they stand for, what they stand against, and so on and so forth. Law, for example, legal scholars, they all think that a trial is at best a story contest, in which opposing counsels construct narratives of guilt and innocence, wrangling over who the real protagonist is. So that criminal or a protagonist, the criminal becoming a protagonist, is just a matter of a story, fine? Similarly, science, the origin of the universe is basically storytelling. And why do we need to know all this? Okay, these are stories that other people and other agencies and other forces are telling us. Now, we tell some of the best stories to ourselves. We are narrating our identity to others, and at the same time, we are narrating the same identity to ourselves. And that identity is nothing but a product of the narratives that we are narrating to others and ourselves. Okay? Memories are nothing but life stories that are boldly fictionalized. Many scientists have actually tried to understand memories. मेमोरीज सारी की सारी आज की डेट में जो मुझे बचपन के बारे में मेमोरीज सताती हैं या खुश करती हैं, उनमें से 50% फैक्ट बेस्ड हैं और 50% fictionalized हैं. Along the years, somewhere fact and fiction has got so enmeshed that my memory can never really be relied upon as fact. Freud calls it screen memory. He says that if you're asking somebody to recollect something, there's a very strong chance that there is something else that has come between the fact and its recollection, and it has changed shape. So we fictionalize even our own memories. I am reminded of, my father. He belongs to Pakistan, and after the partition, they kind of migrated to India, and he was only about 4 years of age when the family had to migrate to India. And he tells me that, when they came into India and they lived in that refugee camp for about a year, obviously everyone was talking about the trauma of this migration. People had been killed, people had lost their property, their livelihood, their loved ones, their limbs, so much. I mean, there was loss all around, there was grief all around, and everyone was living his or her own trauma And at the same time, he said for the next 15 to 20 years of their growing up, all they did was do the household job. Everyone would do whatever was to be done at home. उसके बाद सब लोग एक साथ इकट्ठे होके बैठ जाते थे और सब वही कहानियां रोज सुनाते थे. और फिर आज 70 years down, you know, in time, he says that many of the stories that I believe are memories of my childhood trauma that I have personally faced may actually be memories of other people and their stories that we were listening to all the time. So this becomes a community memory. This becomes a collective memory. So your individual memory, your individual narrative somewhere gets mixed up with the collective narrative. Okay, so हम अपने को क्या कहानियां सुना रहे हैं और अपने बारे में क्या कहानियां सुना रहे हैं. Let's look at those. तो सोशल साइकोलॉजिस्ट क्या कहते हैं कि जब भी हम किसी दोस्त को मिलते हैं, हमारी कॉन्वर्सेशन सबसे मैक्सिमम जो होती है वो गॉसिपी स्टोरीज होती है, एक्सचेंज ऑफ गॉसिप होता है. सो व्हेन वी मीट, वी आस्क द अदर पर्सन व्हाट्स अप, व्हाट्स न्यू. ये जो व्हाट्सअप है, ये क्या है? ये इच्छा है कुछ जानने की. व्हाट्सएप में हम मौसम का हाल तो नहीं पूछ रहे हैं. मौसम के हाल के बाद हम जहां पे आना चाहते हैं, एक्चुअली हम वो पूछना चाह रहे हैं. सो इतनी जरूरत है हमें अपना सुनाने की और दूसरों के बारे सुनने की. दूसरों के बारे में क्यों सुनना है? क्योंकि उसमें मुझे अपने नैरेटिव को कहीं पे प्लेस करना है. हाउ आई नरेट माय ओन सेल्फ इन दैट अदर पर्सन्स नैरेटिव. ओके, सो व्हाट्सएप की इतनी जरूरत है कि हमने एक पूरा ऐप बना दिया व्हाट्सएप. हाँ, and we begin to narrate our lives to another person, trading back and forth tales over cups of tea, unconsciously shaping and embellishing these tales like a hum. All right, ऐसी हमिंग की आवाज आनी शुरू हो जाती है कि उसमें हमारी जो सच है, झूठ है, हम हैं, दूसरे हैं, वो सारे के सारे इन टेल्स के अंदर कहीं ना कहीं बहुत ज्यादा इनमेश हो जाते हैं. And if you look at jokes, you look at urban legends, ये सारे के सारे narratives हैं. ये सारे के सारे narratives हैं. Look at the social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter posts. What are we doing? We are serializing our autobiographies every day on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. We are telling people to look at us in a particular form. We are narrating ourselves every day through a post. This is what you want other people to see you as. Okay, so I think the point is clear that the human imperative to make and consume stories runs even more deeply than literature, than dreams and fantasy. We are soaked to the bone in story from infancy to death. 3-4 साल से हम स्टोरी सुनने और सुनाने का सिलसिला शुरू करते हैं और मरते दम तक कहानियां सुनाते रहते हैं और कहानियां सुनते रहते हैं. Talking of murder infancy, let's talk of childhood and stories. So we all kind of relate childhood as the most active stage of life when stories play a role in our lives. And it is obvious that small children are creatures of story. My own son, when he was about 5 or 6, वो इतनी अजीब बात करता था. He started, he had this fetish for Amar Chitra Kathas, and every time I would go to the mall, he would make me buy another Amar Chitra Katha. And sometimes I would like really flaunt it to my family and friends कि ये ना इतना छोटा है, अभी फर्स्ट में पढ़ता है या केजी में था शायद, and he is reading Amar Chitra Kathas. And अमर चित्र कथा पढ़ने के लिए कुछ तो आपको लैंग्वेज पढ़ने की जरूरत होती है. तो आपको अभी पढ़ने की क्षमता उतनी डेवलप हुई है या नहीं, but I believe that he is my son and his grandparents' grandson, and therefore he's probably really started to read this story. So he would bring home an Amar Chitra Katha. Within 20 minutes he would come back and tell me पढ़ ली. And I would say हाँ. Then one day I told him, okay, मुझे सुनाओ आपने क्या पढ़ा. तो उसने क्या किया, खोली अमर चित्र कथा और वो पढ़ नहीं रहा था ऊपर, उसकी फोटोज देखता था और खुद कहानी बना बना के he would construct his own story and come to the end of it. And then I saw कुछ कुछ कहानी उसने फोटोग्राफ देख के लगभग सिमिलर बना ली हुई थी, and so that is the kind of wonderful capability of children to engage with narratives. They have this immense amount of creativity and imagining. I won't call it creativity, but imagination, yes, that fantastic imagination that can transport them into another world of stories without any effort. So he would play out Harry Potter, he would play out Krish, he would play out his dad all the time. He would be in his combat dress and play out the role of the general. One day he went and told his English teacher in school, "Aap Pakistani general ho, and my father will hang you upside down with the rope on a tree, and then he will come and bombard you with an armored vehicle." The teacher called me the next day, and she said, "You have such a Batamese child," and that's what he said to me. And then I came home and realized that he had actually internalized the fact that he is an army officer just because he's an army officer's son. And he has started to live in that make believe world. And he only knows how to deal with others as generals or as soldiers. So his life was drenched in make believe. He spent most of his waking hours trapezing happily through this neverland, enjoying stories in books and videos or creating these stories. And he would pretend play all the time, one in wonder worlds of good and bad guys. But story was psychologically compulsory at that stage because he was learning through stories. It was something he needed in the way he needed bread and love. And to bar him from this neverland would be an act of violence on my part, and I could never do it. So, despite the fact that I discovered that he was only making up these Amar Chitra Kathas, I did not have the heart to tell him, "Shut up." So, in this respect, my child is not special. Children the world over delight in stories and start shaping their own pretend worlds as toddlers. But when we grow up, we have work to do and we are grown ups. We can't play all the time. Kids have to grow up, and growing up means leaving the pretend space called Neverland behind. But do we really do that? At one level, we are all Peter Pans who never learn how to grow up. If being a child means engaging with stories and loving stories, I think we have only left the nursery with its toy trucks and dress up clothes, but we have never stopped pretending. We just change how we do it. So we are now probably, gifted with other kinds of fantasy, other kinds of narratives and stories, maybe novels, maybe films, maybe advertisements, fantasies. But these are the new Neverland for us. So it's not like only children engage with stories. Adults engaged with stories which are much more sinister, much more nuanced, much more complex, and much more transparent. So even in this age of anxiety, when we are anxious about the demise of the printed book and demise of the habit of reading, we say that readers are increasingly less willing to devote time and energy to reading. No, only the form has changed. There's flash fiction, there's Twitterature, there's dribble, there's drabble, sudden fiction, so many kinds of fiction. So we're not committing ourselves to published books, but that does not mean that we are not committing ourselves to narratives. There's all kinds of journalism, there's all kinds of new media that has surrounded us and replaced what we nostalgically call the lost culture of books. Okay, so one doesn't really have to worry about this disconnect with narrative, disconnect with story reading, disconnect with the culture of stories. Actually, it has only changed shape. So we read less than we used to, but at the same time, we are reading in many more new manners and many newer ways. So we spend a staggering amount of time watching TV or on the screen, and there are new types of fiction that are emerging out of it. A very interesting type of fiction that my son introduced me to was the interactive novel. The interactive novel क्या है कि ये new online novel है, web fiction है, जिसमें आप जब पढ़ रहे हैं तो आप एक स्टेज पे पहुंचते हैं जहां पे आप डिसाइड करेंगे कि आपको ये कैरेक्टर चूज करना है या ये कैरेक्टर चूज करना है, आपको इस डायरेक्शन में जाना है या उस डायरेक्शन में जाना है, तो हाइपर लिंक्स आते जाते हैं. So depending on what character you choose, what direction you choose, what car you choose, you will go into another story. If you picked up the other one, you would have gone into another story. So it's an interactive fiction. So all these are outcomes of this new technology. It's not that we have stopped engaging with narratives. It's just that the method and the style of this engagement may have shifted color. Okay. And then again, I come back to the stories we tell ourselves, and we are the most creative at night. So, you know, when we are sleeping, the untiring brain dreams richly and wildly and at great length. So, consciousness is altered but not extinguished in dreams. ऐसा लगता है कि सो गए हैं, conscious mind सो गया है, पर वो खत्म नहीं हुआ है सोचना. So we just have a limited ability to remember the adventures that we consciously experience through the night. In dreams, our brains live a very different existence, a very separate existence, and they conceal that existence from the waking mind. But the mind has a different set of stories to tell itself during the night. And some researchers think that we dream almost all night long, and we don't stop dreaming even when we are awake, right? We are still daydreaming, we are still fantasizing. And there's another study that said that जो daydream होता है उसका एक average span 14 seconds का होता है, and an average mind has about 2,000 daydreams a day. That is the kind of small stories in those daydreams that we are spinning for ourselves, those fantasies that we are spinning for ourselves. So while our bodies are always locked in a specific here and now, our imaginations are free to run and free to roam space and time. You know, but then there is this paradox in fiction that you know, was noticed by Aristotle in the Poetics, and it says that the stories that we narrate those stories because they give us pleasure. तो जब हम fantasize कर रहे हैं daydream में, या हम सपना देख रहे हैं, तो ये सारे, या जो कहानियां सुना रहे हैं या कहानियां पढ़ रहे हैं, वो क्यों कर रहे हैं? क्योंकि कहानियां हमें pleasure देती हैं. But there is the paradox. Most of our narratives, most of our fiction, most of our stories are deeply unpleasant. There's threat, there's death, there's despair, there's anxiety, there's storm and stress. Take a look at the carnage on the fiction bestseller lists. There are massacres, murders, rapes. It's the same on the TV, you know. So TV shows are all about these. Look at the classical literature: Oedipus, Medea, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Krishna. In sabki kahaniyan, Shakespeare stage strewn with corpses, heavy stuff. But even the lighter stuff is organized around problems. And the readers are riveted by their concern over how it will all turn out. So in short, regardless of genre, if there is no naughty problem, K-N-O-T-T-Y, naughty problem, there's no story. So the pleasure-seeking principle that we attribute stories and narratives to is the most active motivation of these stories. But this pleasure-seeking principle also basically seeks to escape trouble. So which means trouble is always at the center. You're always obsessed and possessed with the thought of encountering trouble, overcoming trouble, or evading trouble. Okay? So if you look at children's make-believe to folk tales to modern drama, everything is about trouble. Conflict is fundamental to fiction. In life, conflict often carries a negative connotation, but in fiction, you don't have to see it as a negative connotation. I mean, if conflict is the fundamental element of fiction, it's not a bad thing, or it's not something that we must denigrate fiction for. Fine. So the idea that stories are about trouble is so commonplace that it verges on becoming a cliche. And the familiarity of this fact has numbed us to how strange this fact can be. But it's true even when we are dreaming. Most of our dreams are about trouble. Most of our dreams are about problems. They are scary dreams. So I think another experiment said that there's only 1 in 10 dreams which is a romantic dream, and out of 100 or something dreams, another dream which could be a happy dream, but most of the other dreams are about they have deep patterns of uh, threat, of despair, of fear, of anger, of death. And stories about love can be there, but stories about fear and death and the challenges of life are what really surround us most of the time. Even if it's about love, there will be some conflict. There will be some, despair. There will be some guilt that will accompany this story, even in the um, even in the dreams, right? So all I'm trying to say is that if we are engaging with this idea of fear and life and despair, why are we doing that? Is it because stories connect with us at the level of the question of survival? Are we trying to deal with challenges of survival all the time? Is that why most of our stories have at their center a problem that has to be dealt with? So if you look at the conventional, movement of a story, what is the movement of the plot? So there's a rising plot, there's a climax, and then there's a resolution, which means that it was understood and taken for granted that stories will always, or if not always, most of the time, will deal with crisis of life. Okay. तो ये जो ड्रीम्स भी थे, ये ऐसा नहीं है कि सिर्फ एक किसी कंट्री के लोग या एक कैटेगरी के लोगों का इस तरह से ड्रीम्स होते हैं. ये जो पूरा एक एक एक्सपेरिमेंट था. The subjects of this experiment were Westerners, were Asians, were Middle Easterns. There were isolated hunter-gatherer tribes. There were children. There were adults. And the most common dream was that they were being chased or attacked. Another universal theme was falling from a great height, or drowning, or being lost, or being naked in public, or getting injured, or getting sick and dying, or being caught in some disaster. So these were the most common dreams that people had, which means even in dreamland, emotions are dominant. The dominant emotions are negative. So basically, all that I'm trying to tell you is that if stories are, narratives of human experience, then these very tales transcend generations. They engage us through emotions, and they connect us through emotions to each other. So we are connected through these narratives. We play politics through these narratives. We use these narratives for many, many, many different things that we are doing and we want to do. And we are used by these same narratives as targets, as victims. So we are perpetrators and victims both, all the time, simultaneously. So through stories, we are sharing our passions, our sadness, our hardships, our joys, and we understand ourselves through stories. We understand others through stories. It is only through stories that we start thinking. बहुत सारी चीजें हमारे अगर हम abstract तरीके से समझाने की कोशिश करेंगे, we cannot understand them until and unless we narrativize that information. So we are always trying to make some kind of map, some kind of schemas, some kind of scripts, some kind of cognitive maps, some mental models, some metaphors, some narrative all the time, so that we can make sense of whatever we are receiving and delivering. All right. And sometimes these narratives can be the question between the difference between life and death. I'm reminded of Scheherazade and Scheheryar in Arabian Nights, 1001 Arabian Nights. I don't know if you know the plot of this whole big volume of 1001 Nights. इसमें क्या है कि शहरयार एक राजा है और वो अपनी पत्नी को एक एक्स्ट्रा किसी अफेयर में मतलब पकड़ लेता है, and he feels very very angry, so he kills this wife and he also kills the people she's cheating him with. And then he decides that he doesn't trust womankind, and therefore he decides that every night he's going to get a new wife and kill her. Now obviously इसके इस decision से कितनी दहशत हुई होगी पूरे kingdom में. So this Scheherazade, this girl, she decides that she's going to offer herself as his bride, and she's going to change this decision for him of his. So what she does is that she convinces her father to give her away as a bride to Shahryar, और फिर वो क्या करती है, हर रात को एक कहानी सुनाना शुरू करती है, और हर रात की कहानी आधी छोड़ती है और अगली रात के लिए उसको छोड़ देती है. तो इस तरह हर रात को वो कहानी सुना रही है, 1001 nights तक वो कहानी सुनाती है, and then there's a change of heart of Shahryar, and he decides that she's not such a bad woman after all, and he falls in love with her. So ये जो एक पूरा life and death में storytelling कितनी important हो सकती है, ये जो एक survival का instinct है जिसके लिए हम stories को use करते हैं, that is the point I'm trying to make here. All right, and everything around us is a question of survival, is a paraphernalia for survival, and therefore everything is a narrative. So let me end by saying and offering you a definition that man is a storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, this is not my definition, I've borrowed it from Graham Swift. So he says man is the storytelling animal. Wherever he goes, he wants to leave behind not a chaotic wake, not an empty space, but the comforting marker buoys and trail signs of stories. He has to keep on making them up. As long as there's a story, it's all right. Even in his last moments, it is said in the split second of a fatal fall, or when he's about to drown, he sees passing rapidly before him the story of his whole life. So even in the last moment of our life, it is a story that is going to take us through. Thank you. So I'm not too sure if I've been able to deliver you any skills that will help you in writing a story, but this was just an endeavor to sensitize you to the, to the kind of stories that we can be surrounded all the time with, and the politics of these stories, so that you are not taken unawares by these stories and you're able to read through them. Sometimes they can be very harmful, sometimes they can be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamayani. And now I would like to invite the participants for any questions, any interaction. They can have, the house is open to it. Anyone would like to ask anything?
Hello, ma'am.
Everyone seems to be in a state of shock. Okay, yes, Rajan, please.
Not a state of shock. Actually, I was carefully listening to ma'am's lecture, and I got transported to some to a different zone, where I was reflecting and trying to understand what was being spoken. And I really want to thank ma'am that all that she has told us, I didn't know before. So it was very new and very enriching experience for me to have listened to her. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rajan. That's
just one, Sapna.
Yes, ma'am.
Usha Bande at this end. I just want
Yes,
to say, not a question, just an observation. Kamayani said about unreliability of memory. I remembered one movie, and based on that movie, there is a word that has come into use, is Rashomon effect. It's a Japanese word. It means memory is really, many times, when it is recollected after a while, everybody will tell different thing about the same thing. Rashomon effect. That's what I just wanted to say is thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
I'm just reminded of one
Um,
quote which I read. Yes, Anurup, please continue.
no, ma'am, you can continue.
No, please.
Okay, so like it's not a question again. I was just reminded of an exercise I did in my college, Srishti Institute of Design. So like we had to, take personalities we see every day, not us, but like people we know every day, and like make a separate new personality about it with all the traits and everything. And then for a week, we had to actually maintain their social media accounts,
Hmm.
like what that particular person would post, what he would not post. If it's an old person, what kind of pictures she would post. So I was kind of reminded of that. And like थोड़ा सा मतलब जो उषा बंदे मैम ने जो भी बोला राशमोन इफेक्ट, तो उस पर मैं थोड़ा सा और बोल देता हूँ. मतलब like that film was called Rashomon only, and the best Academy Film Award for the best foreign film was actually invented for that particular film. So like
Yeah.
narratives, like in that story, there is this horrifying incident that happens, and everybody has a different take on it. The policeman has a different take, the victim has a different take. So that was something I was reminded of.
Yes. Thank you, Anurup. That's wonderful.
I think that is how narratives weave into a larger picture, where you have different perspectives and different way of reacting to a certain situation. I'm just reminded of this quote that I read by Mitch Albom. He says, there's a story behind everything: how a picture got on a wall, how a scar got on your face. Sometimes the stories are simple, sometimes they are very hard and heartbreaking. So I think whatever Dr. Kamainti has tried to tell us about the narratives is that every little aspect of our existence, every little aspect of our being can engage and can bring out another story in us, and we can share these experiences, we can bring out these experiences, and uh, people can view them differently than what the writer intends to. And so that is the whole beauty of the narratives.
And
Yes,
also be warned that it's all only a story.
yes,
Yes. Thank you.
yes.
Ma'am,
Anyone
I have a
else,
question,
please?
ma'am.
Yes, please, Divankar, go ahead.
Good afternoon, ma'am. First of all, I would like to thank you for the fascinating session. And my question is that I'm interested in research regarding the narratological analysis of movies. So, any advices that you would like to give or suggestions for that?
Yes, absolutely. I think narrative and discourse analysis are quite the in thing these days when it comes to research, and a lot of film studies, I think, does involve narrative analysis. So I don't know who you're going to work with